it is Brittany here from Lo and Behold Stitchery, and this video is to demonstrate how to cut the fabrics for your summer pop quilt. So first we're going to start out with the ice cream portion. I have a 1/4 yard here. I'll show you how to cut a fat quarter after this, but a 1/4 yard is 9 inches times the width of fabric. Normally the width of fabric is about 42 to 44 inches. It can vary from fabric manufacturer to fabric manufacturer. What I have here is a Kona solid, and usually Kona solids are 44 inches. So basically we have a little bit more wiggle room than the pattern assumes. And whenever you order a 1/4 yard, you'll notice that you have these 2 selvage ends here, and the ends are kind of frayed a little bit. And basically, whenever you cut yardage, it's really important that you make sure that these 2 selvage ends are right on top of each other, either perfectly aligned or at least a little bit parallel like this. For some quilt patterns, it will really matter that your fabric is folded square. For this quilt pattern, it doesn't matter quite as much, but I try to get in the habit of checking this before I cut any piece of yardage, regardless of what pattern I am using it for. So basically, you will align your selvages, make sure they're parallel, and then that might mean that you have to recreate a new fold. So sometimes fabric gets stored on the bolt a little bit wonky, and this fold isn't perfectly square. So if that's the case, you might have to press a new fold, and then you are ready to cut. So I have my piece here, and basically I'm going to cut it 2 layers at a time. Let me realign my selvages there. And so you'll see that this can make your piece a little bit off over here. So what I'm going to do is create a fresh edge. And in order to do that, I am going to align the fold of my fabric up here with a horizontal line in my ruler. And then that way, whenever I cut along this edge, I know that I have a square piece of fabric. So I always like to make sure that I'm not cutting off too much, because you don't want to waste fabric, but you do want to cut off enough to where it captures sort of both of those layers. So we will cut just like that. And then at this point, I like to rotate my cutting mat around. I try not to pick up my fabric and move it too much, because that can make it so that my pieces get a little bit off. So I like to rotate my cutting mat whenever I can. And so then I have my fresh edge right here. And so what I'm going to do is align the line in my ruler with that fresh edge. Now, if you are using a longer ruler that maybe isn't wide enough, or if you don't have a long ruler, what you can do is use a 12-inch square ruler, and you'll basically cut your fabric in segments. So you'll line it up right here, making sure that this fold is aligned with the horizontal line, and you'll cut one segment, and then you'll move it up and cut the other. Some people like to fold their fabric in half and cut through 4 layers at a time. I normally try to steer clear of doing this. I find that the more times that I fold my fabric, the more opportunity it has to get a little bit wonky. So generally speaking, I find that if I can fold my fabric the least amount of times, then normally I have a more accurate cut. So I normally just cut 2 pieces at a time, either doing it in segments like that, or using my long ruler like this. So again, we're lining up this vertical measurement that we need over here on that fresh edge that we just cut, and then down here we're making sure that this fold is aligned with a horizontal line in our ruler, and then that creates a 90-degree angle. So once we have that, we can cut. So you're kind of walking your hand up the ruler there, and then if you would like, you can save this scrap piece of fabric and cut it up into strips and use it as your binding. Okay, so I have my width of fabric piece cut here. Now I'm going to rotate my cutting mat and trim off my selvages. So to do that, I am aligning the edge with the edge of my ruler up there, and it should also align with this measurement mark down here. I'm going to shimmy it over because I don't want to cut off too much of my selvages. There we go. So now I can rotate it again. And now I can cut my piece of fabric. So I'm lining up that final measurement with this line over here, making sure that it stays square with my ruler as I'm cutting. So I'm cutting 2 at a time. So that was 1, 2. Three, 4. So from each quarter yard, you should get 4 of these rectangles. Let's go ahead and cut off our selvage first. I'm going to flip it this way. Use the ruler. Roughly align it with those little dots for my selvage. Cut all the way across. And then I'm going to rotate create a fresh edge over here. So orientation matters with cutting. You can't just cut the rectangles whichever way you like. You have to really make sure that you're paying attention to the orientation of that rectangle. So this is my 18 inches. This is 21 inches. So I am going to use my square ruler so that I can get that longer measurement first. I'm going to cut it in segments. Okay, so there's my first one. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees because these are all fresh edges. They're nice and square. And then I'm going to cut my shorter measurement. Making sure that it's aligned down here. There we go. So there's 1. 2. This is scrap. And then I'll do that again. And 4. Alrighty, so from that fat quarter, I got 4 of my ice cream rectangles. Okay, so I have my fat quarter. The 18 inches is on this side with the selvage, so I'm going to cut that off first. And I'm actually going to position my selvage so that it comes just 1/4 of an inch into my ruler, just to give me a little bit of extra wiggle room. Since this fat quarter cut is so tight, I will gladly take any extra wiggle room that I can get. My seam allowance that is going to be along this edge of my cut pieces is going to be 1/4 of an inch. So if my little selvage dots are within 1/4 of an inch, then that will be hidden within the seam allowance. So there is my first cut. And then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees and do my second cut. And this will create my square edge down here. Okay, so looking at the cutting diagram, the first thing to cut that makes sense to me are those smaller squares on the bottom right corner of the cutting diagram. So since I'm right-handed, I am actually going to rotate my fat quarter this way, and then I'm going to cut my squares from this corner. So I'm going to add up the total length of my squares. So there's 6 squares there, so 6 times the measurement of those squares. And then I am going to cut that amount. And I might do just like a tiny smidge above that, no more than like 1/8 of an inch, just to give myself a little tiny bit of wiggle room. So I have the width of my squares by the total width of all 6 of the squares, plus just a couple of threads of wiggle room. So I'm going to cut that very carefully. When I get to the top, I'm going to stop, flip this up, and then I'm going to cut across the top. When I do that, I'm going to look down and make sure that my fabric didn't move at all. There we go. So now from this, I'm going to cut my squares, my smaller squares. Okay, so there are my 6 smaller squares. So now let's look at our fat quarter. I'm going to flip it back so that we can look at it exactly like it's pictured in the diagram. Okay, so I've cut off my bottom right portion. So now I think it's safe to go ahead and cut up this portion. So these are the rectangles that are along the bottom edge of that fat quarter diagram. So I'm going to rotate my fabric again. And now I'm going to cut the long portion of those rectangles. So using my square ruler seems to be the trick for this step. So I'm lining up a line down here with the fresh edge over here, and I'm just going to cut all the way across because there's nothing else that I need to cut from this portion. So I'm going to do it in segments. Okay, and then I'm going to rotate 90 degrees and cut up my rectangles. So double check the measurements. It's really easy to get some of these numbers mixed up. And 6, so we had some wiggle room there, which is good. Okay, so there's our 6 longer rectangles along the bottom. Now I think we can go ahead and cut the rectangles that go in this top left corner. So first I am going to square up this side right here. So I'm going to flip this over, align my ruler with the edge on the bottom here. This will give us a 90-degree angle. Don't waste too much. And I'm going to flip it back over. Okay, so top left corner of the diagram, I am going to cut. So I'm cutting the smaller portion of the rectangles first. It's really important that you get your rectangles oriented correctly before you start cutting. I'm just going to go ahead and cut all 3 of those strips all the way across. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and cut these strips into our pieces. And if you would like, you can stack them right on top of each other. You only want to do this if you have a sharp rotary blade so that your cuts are nice and clean. You can stack them on top of each other and cut all three at once, or you can just do them one at a time. Either way. So there's 3. And 6. So those are our rectangles in the top left corner of the cutting diagram. Okay, so now we have this piece left. I'm gonna go ahead and cut, for my bigger rectangle, I'm gonna cut my longest measurement first. And then my smaller measurements, again, double check those numbers because they're all kind of close but slightly different. Okay, and then we just have those smaller rectangles. So once you have all of your pieces cut from your fat quarter, I like to stack them in a pile like this. And then you're just gonna keep going for all of your fat quarters for your background portion of the quilt. If you accidentally miscut something, I did want to point out that sometimes it's okay to Frankenstein your pieces together. So say you only have, these pieces left over. If you need a longer rectangle, then you can cut this up and sew pieces together and then cut a larger piece from that portion. Sometimes it's easier to do that than it is to buy more fabric. Once the quilt is quilted and washed, you will not even be able to notice that those are separate pieces of fabric in that background portion. So once you have cut your ice cream portion and your background portion, whether you are doing the multicolor background or the solid yardage option that is demonstrated on the cover quilt, then you need to cut a strip or 2 of the stick portion of your fabric, and then that will get strip pieced a little bit later. Once you have those main sections of your fabric cut, then you are ready to start sewing. So I hope that you found this video helpful. I will see you next time when we begin to sew these blocks together.